As somebody who's a little bit older, you can look at TBM as this opportunity to rewrite your story and not to feel like you're this foregone conclusion. That's not your story anymore. It's time to create a new one and start living as that person.
From To Be Magnetic, this is the Expanded Podcast with your host, Lacey Phillips. As the leading destination for neural manifestation, we dispel the woo-woo in order to help you create real, tangible results based on neuroplasticity, psychology, epigenetics, and energetics. Our goal is to normalize the practice of manifestation and empower you to get into the driver's seat of your life in order to manifest the experiences, relationships, and things that most align with your authenticity. Part of our manifestation process entails expanding past your limiting subconscious beliefs. Therefore, by tuning into this podcast with interviews from experts, thought leaders, spiritual teachers, scientists, and those with neural manifestation success stories, you're starting the process of expanding your subconscious in order to see to believe that anything you desire is possible. And by pressing play, the process begins. Welcome back to another process episode, which is where we showcase one of our pathway members who have gone on to manifest something extraordinary or big within their life, may it be career, home, relationship, financial. This has become one of your favorite podcast segments that we have, as we can tell by the numbers. And one commonality that I want to make that you'll begin to recognize each of these pathway members share in common from past episodes to new is that not one of them simply dipped their feet into the work or flirted with it. They went all in. I've been able to see this recently with my dad who's doing the work. They sort of touch in, don't really do the DIs, do it once in a while, skip around the workshops without finishing them. Whereas what you'll listen to with each of these episodes, these are the people that started with how to manifest, moved into shadow, moved into inner child, did all of the workshops, listened to every one of the supported classes, which is our once a month class where Jessica and I go through in the pathway answering members' questions. And then they've gone on to listen to every podcast episode. That's what you will hear from each of the pathway members that we share on this. And not because we're only picking people who do that, the ones who actually manifest the big things, they go all in. And not only that, but once they've gone through the work, and they get a baseline of it, they make it their own. So a past guest, Heather Whitaker, you heard that in the Deep Imaginings, she started out with them, listening to them, and they weren't as effective to her. So she figured out her own process that when she walks on hikes, she talks the prompts aloud. So she'll listen to them in her earbuds. Once she's heard the prompts, she then goes and talks out what's been prompted until she gets to the block, and then she reprograms it. And you have to imagine, even as you're walking and listening, you're in a hypnotic state because your brain, your conscious mind isn't flying around. You've now gone into an alpha or a theta. So that's what you'll also find in commonality with these members. They make it their own. They don't stop when they get a roadblock. They actually figure out their own way through it. Today will be no exception. So I'm going to kick it over to my co-host, Jessica Gill, who you've heard on the Explained episodes and the Process episodes, as she highlights another really exciting member within the pathway and how they've gone on to manifest something extraordinary.
Welcome back to another episode of Expanded. Jessica here. I am so excited because we have another incredible process episode for you today. And it's really cool because this process guest, Kelley, part of the things that she manifested was a book deal with a top publisher, a film and TV agent with UTA, which is a top agency, creating a 6 figures in her bank account in a matter of months from savvy investing and increased income. She manifested a new spiritually aligned friendship, comfort and confidence in her own beauty and sexuality, and less fear around health and wellness. And what's really cool is on top of all of these amazing things, the week that her episode airs, her book is for pre-sale on Amazon, and she's hit #1 bestseller on Amazon in so many charts for women's literary fiction, contemporary women's fiction, mother and children fiction, marriage and divorce fiction, women in romance fiction, and then #2 in the Kindle store and #2 of overall literature and fiction. I mean, oh my gosh. And the odds that this came the exact week that her episode aired, which was a complete coincidence, but also very kismetly aligned, I just think is so, so, so cool. Kelley is a longtime TBM member who was able to go through different chapters and phases with the work so she could uncover it and make it work the best for her. She is also a mom and has been teaching bits and pieces of this work to her children, and also talks a lot about finding time for that sacred space and time with yourself while parenting and looking at all of those pieces. The other thing I really loved about Kelley's story, she talked about this shadow word of average. And I don't think we talk about that a lot, because the more people I ask about, shadow words and all of that, it's not so much the polar opposites on some things. Sometimes it's just the word average. So many of us want to be individuals and independent and stand out and be seen and heard for who we authentically are. And we talk a lot about how schooling systems can promote this idea of average and make us feel less than if we're average in certain areas, and how we can be average in some areas, but we are all exceptional at different things, which makes us so unique and interesting. So it's an incredible episode. I can't wait for you guys to dive in. Congrats, Kelley. She probably doesn't even know that I'm sharing her rankings of bestsellers from Amazon. I'm just so proud of her and so excited to share this episode. And a quick note, I know that I shared with you guys about our live Q&A event with Lacey, myself, and the coaches at OSEA, but we have a digital event recording that is now on sale. You can check out the link in the show notes to purchase. If you weren't able to be with us there in person, then this is the next best thing. You can see what the event looked like and then hear all of the questions that we answered, see the entire speaking portion between myself, Lacey, and the coaches. We cover jumping off cliffs, manifesting career, feeling left out, late bloomer syndrome, the importance of your authentic code, shadow, deservingness, tests, triggers. I mean, we cover so many things, so I know you guys will love it, and check that out in the show notes. And without further ado, here is the episode. Enjoy! I'm so excited to have Kelley. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so as you know, big time TBMer here, doing the work since 2019, correct?
Yes.
So what is your sun, moon, and rising sign?
So I'm a Leo sun and a Gemini moon and a Sag rising. And I'm also a reflector 6-2.
Oh, interesting. How do you feel like they all present for you?
So I only know some parts of this, but it's funny because I never really paid much attention to astrology because I never identified with all of the characteristics of a Leo. It was just like such the opposite of who I was. I believed in it, but just not for myself. And it wasn't until I met with a really wonderful astrologer about a year ago, and she explained to me, she showed me how much Leo was actually in my chart, and that actually I was this courageous and vibrant and showy person underneath it all, but the Leo had been kind of conditioned out of me. And that it was time for me to start embracing that part of my personality. And when she explained it that way and then walked me through the rest of my chart, it all started to make so much sense and it felt really empowering. And so I I've loved astrology since then, even though I don't fully, I definitely leave it to the experts. And then human design, the reflector, I really identify with. As soon as I found human design and realized that I was a reflector, I was like, oh, okay, this all makes so much sense.
Yeah. It's interesting too hearing how you didn't really resonate with anything about your sign, especially Leo. And it's almost like that was your sort of soul's mission of incorporating that and getting to your self-worth enough where Leo felt like a comfortable place to be.
Yeah, it was just so the opposite of who I was. And somebody who had these issues with like invisibility and tended to be more of a wallflower and just none of these beautiful Leo qualities. So yeah, the more I learned about it, the more it started to affect my life because I was able to start using the tools. So it's been really cool since then, but it's been relatively new for me.
Very cool. And what about your cultural background and upbringing?
So I was raised in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, and my parents divorced when I was just a couple years old. My dad moved to LA not too long after that, and I'm an only child. I was raised by a single mom for most of my formative years, like the younger formative years. And it was a really loving environment, but it was definitely a culture of survival mode where it was definitely like an environment of we're in this together, we're going to get through this together. And yeah, so then a few years later, she married my stepfather, and that changed the dynamic of everything and introduced a whole new set of challenges and just complexities, and that really had a lasting effect on the rest of my life. During all that time, I was spending a lot of time with my grandparents, and they had a huge impact on me. They lived in this like bucolic rural area of Pennsylvania. So I would go there and it felt very healing. I would hear lots of stories of my grandfather whose family had immigrated from Italy, and he was first generation, and hearing lots of really wonderful stories about these like amazing women in their family who had done all kinds of incredible things. And then during all of that time, I would go to my dad's house every once in a while in LA. And he was like, it was the 80s and he was in finance in LA and like all of the things that would bring to mind. So it was this completely different environment of like big living and multiple houses and like all these cool things. So I would go there and be with this really vibrant lifestyle. And then I would go back to this quieter, vanilla Christian Catholic upbringing in suburban Pittsburgh.
Do you feel like a lot of people, I think, with suburbs, sometimes the small townness of certain suburbs can feel really nurturing and caring, and sometimes it can feel really stifling and small, like you want to escape and go to the big city or, that kind of energy. Do you feel like you resonated with one of those?
I grew up knowing that I didn't want to live in the suburbs because I just didn't feel like I belonged there. There was this culture in my community and in my family, and I think this was a Pittsburgh thing. I don't live there anymore, and I haven't lived there for a long time, and it's become a lot more like an artistic community, and it's just really become an amazing city. But when I was growing up, it was amazing then too, but in a different way. But the culture of it was very much, for me, like, as long as you have a house and a good job and a pension and your health, then, like, that's all you need. And anything else is just so far out of what is necessary that there really weren't a lot of opportunities to grow. And so when I would go to LA and I'd be with my dad, it was really expansive for me because I'd see a completely different lifestyle and hear about travel and see these people who had like these amazing careers. And so, yeah, the suburbs, I like what you said about it being safe. And there's so much value to that. And believe me, it's a privileged environment to be raised in because as long as your basic needs are going to be met in that kind of environment. And so you don't have a lot to complain about, but there's also like that, definite need to get out and to live something different.
Well, even you saying, your basic needs are met, there's still the fear there of things can get taken away. You had written in your submission, your home environment was where low self-worth was a way of life. just good enough or laying on that like, oh, you have to be better at this or wherever it may be. How do you feel like that low self-worth sort of block wove through your life?
So yeah, that is such an accurate statement that it was just woven into my life. I think it was, my mom was this very gentle, loving soul, but she had been through a lot, and we had this like enmeshed relationship where she went through a period of time where she had this very low opinion of herself and what she could do with her life, and she spoke in terms of we. So it was, well, this is all we can do, and this is where we are going, and this is what's possible for us. So yeah, that was why it seemed like it was just like a way of life. Like there was just this limitation, and I would look around, and as a kid, I would feel like, no, I just have this feeling I'm meant for something different and bigger and really kind of amazing. But I was getting this messaging of staying small, because if you didn't, the environment I was in, especially in my later adolescent years, was you just had to stay small and quiet. Otherwise, you were going to be in a bad place. Things were going to get ugly. And then that was the same in my community as well. It was like, there was a reward for being sort of average. And if you had these really big goals or wanted to do something outside of the norm, you'd kind of get the side eye. Like, who do you think you are? And that's probably not going to happen for you. And so I learned to just kind of stay small.
I think that's so true for so many people, is that sort of messaging of, especially when you're around a community of people who are like just comfortable at the state that they're in. They're not really interested in growth. The idea that someone could outgrow where they're at, whether that's career, home, where they live, their dreams, it's really scary. So it's like you're pushing up against all a community's shadow. And the idea that you could like leave and go have a successful life elsewhere is really fearful to them. And so, it's that projection, oh, we have to keep them small too, because if it's possible for them, then that means it was possible for me, and I didn't live that dream, and I'm not ready to face that dream. So I'm just going to tell them it's not possible for them either.
Absolutely. That is so true.
So how did you find the To Be Magnetic work? You sort of say your experience with TBM was in two phases, really. Phase one of kind of coming into yourself and learning what that meant and what your patterning really was. And then phase two of really actualizing these goals and leaning into exactly what you were clear on, what you wanted to manifest. So talk a bit about that beginning journey with TBM.
Yeah. So I had started off a couple of years ago in this journey with the Hoffman process. And I think that I know there have been some other guests who have at times mentioned that they've done this as well. And there's a lot of crossover in TBM work. You're going through old patterning, and I had been sort of primed from that experience to understand the idea of like looking at your parents and the patterns you inherited, both good and bad, from them, and finding compassion for that and for what they went through as well. So I was sort of primed. So I found Joe Dispenza first. So it was like the Hoffman process and then Joe Dispenza. And then I found Lacey on the Goop podcast, like so many people have. And as soon as I listened, I think I listened to like 2 podcast episodes and was like, wait a minute, this is amazing. And I jumped in and did the clarity exercise just to kind of test it out and see if it was going to work for me. And then I dove right in and became a member right away. So yeah, you're right. Yes, it was. So there were 2 different phases for me of TBM. So the first part was really just like unpacking everything and learning the process, learning how it all worked, and going back, a lot of years to like really dig into these childhood memories, so many of which I had not thought of in so many years, that it was a big deal to kind of take a look at everything. And it was funny because I had done almost all of the workshops, but things weren't really coming in, and I was doing it really dutifully, like this dutiful schoolgirl, and I was checking it off and doing it regularly. So I felt like I was doing the work well, but something was just off, and I was feeling these little sparks of magnetism that I could see happening, like these little micro shifts. But I decided to take a little bit of a break. And then when I came back in, I decided to go with a coaching experience. So I got in touch with Atara, who was like so amazing. And he changed the whole thing. So first thing he did was I just threw out my entire list and I replaced the whole list with the words self-worth, because he had explained to me that I had gotten to this point where I knew that I was deserving of all of these things on an intellectual level, but emotionally, I just didn't feel that way at all. And that's why things weren't coming through. So that was a big game changer. And then the second phase was me just going through and saying, I'm going to manifest a feeling of self-worth. And then I'm going to manifest all of the qualities that I want in this person that I'm trying to become one by one. And when I started doing that, like all the magic started happening.
That's such a cool way to approach it. I think because so many people in the community definitely go the dutiful student route. You know, they're like, I see this workshop, I do this DI, I do this journal prompt. And they're having results and things are starting to shift on, you know, the neurological level. But there's that sense of clarity. And I wonder, and Atar is such an incredible coach for this because he saw that sort of happening. But in your, let's say, original list that you had, it's like you were trying to achieve these things that you thought would bring the self-worth. And instead of achieving the things, it's like, let's bring the self-worth and the things can meet you naturally.
Totally. Yes. I had these ideas of what I wanted and I was so sure, like I knew I deserved them. I had earned them and, you know, the career things and things like that. I felt like they were possible for me. But yeah, if you don't have that belief, it's like you have to become the person that you want to be in order to be able to experience all the things you're calling in. And if you go about it backwards, it just doesn't work. And I could feel these things sort of hovering around me. And I'm like, well, why can I not bring this in? And that was why. And so when I started to make those really deep shifts, I could feel the emotions moving through my body and just sort of purging all of these old thoughts that didn't serve me anymore. It was really this emotional time. It was so powerful. And when those shifts happened, I actually started to become the person that I had been seeing in the magnetic self DIs. When I would look in the mirror, I would say like, okay, I'm starting to become this person. And now it matches all these things that I've been trying to call in. And so then they started to present themselves.
I love that. And I think that's so interesting too, because at least I've had this experience with the work where, you know, there's certain blocks or things that I'm trying to clear and certain things I'm trying to call in and things come through and the box clear and that process moves along. But I think I've released things in one category, let's say, but there's still more work to be done. And so oftentimes I think we look at, okay, well, my ideal version of self, my true authentic self is, you know, here. And I'm kind of like pointing up in the sky. And where we're at is like here. And it's like, you know, middle rung or whatever it is. And there's a gap between those two. And there are very clear things we need to let go of and behave differently if we're going to get to that next step. And we start changing little by little, but when we get really serious about deciding we're no longer going to carry around this limiting belief, we are no longer going to hold on to this and then take action because of that, really big things start to shift. Like even for me, some of my biggest triggers are lack mentality and body image stuff. And there's so many times where I'm like, I'm at a great place with my body image. Everything's, you know, I nailed it. I'm through that block. And something will come up again. And I'm reminded I'm still holding on to it for some reason. How can I examine it? And this is kind of what I'm going through right now. How can I examine it from a different perspective? And what would it feel like to actually not go through these negative self-talks in my head about my body? Like, what would that feel like? How could I present as that person? And so those are some of the blocks you were coming up with as invisibility, unwanted, and average, which I think is such a powerful block to have in there. So talk about some of those blocks that were coming up for you.
So it's so interesting the way you just described that, because it's funny. That was one of the shifts that I made in this, what I would call like the second phase. So I would be in these DIs and, you know, I'm so in it. I would start to like really become this magnetic version of myself where I didn't feel average and I didn't feel invisible. And I felt like almost, I don't want to use the word cured, but it was like I had let go of all of these beliefs. But it's funny because you might think it's not working because you get out of this, DI and you're sort of floating and you're like, I've got this, and you are that person that you saw in your DI, but then you're like running errands and I'm picking up the kids from school and then somebody like cuts me off in traffic. And then you suddenly drop back into this other version of yourself that's more on this like lower level. And you think, oh man, this isn't working, but it actually is, especially if you're somebody who is older and has been doing, kind of living in these patterns for so many years. It's hard to start embodying that different version of yourself. So it is working. It just takes time. And so then little by little, I would start to see shifts and I'd say, wow, I really like the way I handled that. Maybe it would be something with my kids where I would have handled it differently a couple of years ago. But since doing TBM, I could see just this really graceful change happening. And that's what's fun to look back at. But in terms of the blocks, when I was just sort of going through it methodically, I don't think I was going in quite deep enough. And so I changed the way I did things where I would journal first and put some music on and really just kind of honor the process because this was really painful stuff. And then I started to become less afraid of digging deeper. So I would get into these DIs and then I would so fully embody, like I would rewrite the whole story, which is I know what we're supposed to be doing, but I would do it on such a level that I actually still have simultaneous memories of a version of, say, my magnetic father. They're so real to me from having done these DIs so many times that it feels just as real to me as the actual memories. So Atara had given me this great tool, which was he would say, okay, write down a quality of yourself that you really want to embody or a block that you've had trouble with, let's say average. And he would say, okay, find an event in your life where you had this quality missing and now add it in and have all of the people around you treat you as if you have overcome that block or are now embodying this like wonderful quality. Maybe it's charisma or, successful, whatever those words are that you might use that you might want. And I would go through, I would take it through my elementary school years. I would invent these whole scenarios in my teen years and what that would have been like to have parents that could have been a little bit more present or whatever you need. Teachers really kind of encouraging you and saying you're special or you're talented or we see such wonderful things for you, kiddo, those things you need to hear. And then I would take it into adulthood because like I mentioned before, when you're doing the work a little bit older, you have all of these adult experiences that may not be as important in terms of TBM work as the 0 to 14-year-old, but they're still powerful because those are really strong reinforcing events that happened in your life and they may have been traumatic. So I would actually relive those experiences as a new and improved version. And so when I came out of the DI, it was like, wow, I have this whole life behind me of being this really like kind of charismatic Leo type person and not invisible and not average. And I have these memories of parents and caregivers and teachers treating me as, in all of the ways that we would hope to be treated as a kid.
Wow. I think that's such a powerful testament to going in. I mean, in order to create those neural pathways that are making you have these memories that feel that they're coinciding with actual memories, which is the goal of the work, you have to be going into these DIs a lot and giving yourself a lot of space in there and really giving visualizations and, 5 senses sort of emotions in there. What DIs were you using to go deep into these scenarios?
So I had done all of the workshops first. And I started with how to manifest like we all do, and then inner child and money and partnership. I did all of those, but it was actually when I went back and did shadow and inner child over and over again, which is kind of hard work. I mean, inner child is no joke and it really puts you through the paces. And so it was those that I think that caused the biggest shifts. But then there were also the unblocked full moon is a really wonderful one. It's like this open-ended DI where you can make it your own. And sometimes that was really powerful for me because I needed to have the space sometimes without as many prompts to just create this whole world for myself. And so I had gone through all of them, but it was those two that caused the biggest shifts for sure.
I think it's so cool too that you mentioned it feels like you have actual memories with your father that didn't happen but were supportive. Like you can go to your recall and be like, oh yeah, my dad would have said this.
Totally. But, I think where I came up with that is I'm a writer and I started to apply so I'm a fiction writer, and I am so used to world building and creating characters that I was able to apply that to the DIs. And I would say, wait a minute, instead of just sort of going through it like a list, I actually started building characters and then rewriting stories. And so, as a writer or any kind of artist, you see that whole world in your head just as clearly as you see the real world in front of you. It kind of is what makes us do what we do. And so you become really good at feeding that part of your imagination. So like I can have imaginary conversations with characters that I write all day long. So it was really kind of no different to apply that same technique once I framed it that way. And it was just so fun because I got to go back and have these just really powerful and moving experiences with two parents that I knew they would have wanted to be if they had not been limited themselves. They had the best of intentions, and I found so much compassion for them. But it was like, oh, is this who you would have been? Like I got to see what their version of being their magnetic selves would have been. Once I created that, it just took off. And so, yeah, it is fun to have those memories live side by side.
And you spoke too of like how for someone who's coming into this work, let's say in their 20s, a lot of those formative memories, and you touched on this a little bit before, but those formative memories are relatively fresh. They're in the past like decade or two, whereas someone in their 40s, 50s, 60s, it's been entrenched for so long. The reinforcing in adulthood, like you said, has been entrenched for so long. And so sometimes it takes a bit longer to source those memories, to find the blocks, to reprogram and create a childhood in your mind, especially when you have really pivotal things that have happened in your childhood and now it's decades later. Talk a little bit about too the process with processing grief with your dad.
So I remember the first time I had a really powerful experience with him. He died when I was 17. So I was left with a lot of unresolved issues there. And I was able to go in and have this conversation with him that was so real that I'm certain it was with him. And it was this very spiritual experience. And I came out of it just sobbing. And it took me several days of grief, of just having to go through that. And I actually took a break, even though I was sort of supposed to be doing this almost every day for this month that Atara had assigned me. I just said, you know what, I need to take a couple of days because it took that long to process that grief. And it was just such a beautiful experience of him saying to me, like, I know you deserved better and I know you deserved more. And you have all of these amazing things that are in your world of possibility. And now it's time for you to see them the way I was not able to show you at the time. And then my mom would visit Whit, came into the picture as well. And it was like these two beautiful human beings that I could see were in there all along. They just, we all have our issues that we can't get past. And when I was able to spend that time with them, so much healing happened that I was able to say goodbye to those old stories for good. And that was the most powerful shift I had, because it was like, we tell these stories over and over again in our heads, and that's how they become entrenched. And like you said, when you're in your 20s, there's a little less unpacking to do. It's still just as difficult, and we're still all doing the same work together because we've all been 0 to 14. But when you're older, you're just far more removed from it. And it's hard to pull some of that out. And then once you do, you're really deep in there. And it does take a little more time. And then, you do have to kind of apply it to, like I mentioned to you earlier, there's a whole new world, like post-Saturn return. You really do start over. And so there's a lot that happens then that you can start to unpack and take through the TBM work. And there's a lot of healing there as well.
Definitely. And I love that you reprogram adulthood memories as well, because sometimes the trigger points, even though the core and the root may have been in childhood, there's so many times you can try to nail that one memory. Let's say you have around something from childhood, but then if that one memory was then spiderwebbed out and reinforced here, 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 and here. Like I was doing one of the shadow workshop DIs this morning around body image, my trigger of the month right now. And it was like, what was the memory that was most painful? And I always thought it was this one memory of, a childhood crush making fun of the way I looked. And actually, it came in a college boyfriend making fun of the way I look came through. And I was like, whoa, I always thought that was just like a side effect because I had this fear from when I was so young. But actually, maybe I need to look at this more recent memory that was also really painful and really impactful. And I think we don't talk about that enough.
Wow, that is so true. I think we have those instant recall memories, like you said, that you're like, oh, this part of me came from this terrible thing that happened at one point in time. And then you look at it and you realize there may have been other events in your life that just reinforced it in a big way. It's funny because I remember I was maybe 11 or 12 and a teacher looking at me and actually using the word kind of average. And she actually called me that at one point in time. Wow. I was looking at her going, I don't feel that way. And you still have belief in yourself when you're little. That's what's so amazing. What I'm noticing in my own kids is that you still have all this belief in yourself, and you can look at somebody as a kid and be like, I'm going to go along with what you're saying, but I actually don't believe you. I'm not this thing. And yeah, it's funny because as you start to get older, you forget about that belief in yourself and you just start to believe everybody else. As a writer or any kind of person in the artistic world, you endure so much rejection. I mean, it's such a cliche, lots of rejection in writing and acting and all of these things in music, and it just goes with the territory. But it's actually really reinforcing each time you get passed over or not noticed, and it's reinforcing whatever that was in fifth grade that happened initially, or those messages you're getting from your parents or your community that you're just not somebody to be noticed in any way. Yeah, I would say that's like phase 3 of my TBM work, because I had done so much of the work around my childhood that it was like, okay, well, wait, now I have these really big things that happened to me, especially in my 20s and 30s. So let's take a look at that. And you can apply the same skills to those, and it just deepens the healing.
So I'm quickly interrupting this episode to invite you, if you're ready to start your manifestation journey, or if anything you've heard in our manifestation episodes has piqued your interest to begin. We have a la carte workshops in everything from the basics bundle, which is what we recommend to everyone who starts. It's the formula that actually teaches you how to manifest, unblocked inner child, and unblocked shadow. We also have a la carte workshops on love and money. But the real gem is the Pathway membership, because it encompasses every single workshop we have. It's a year-long membership with full access to the few a la carte offerings we have and exclusive workshops not available anywhere else, such as the daily practice, which is what everybody in the Pathway uses, hopefully at least 3 times a week to daily, in order to truly create the new neural pathways that one needs in order to manifest, and houses the library of our deep imaginings, which is our unique hypnosis process that allows you to get into your subconscious and overwrite those old neural pathways, creating the new ones. You can use our special code EXPANDED, all caps, EXPANDED, to receive $20 off your first a la carte workshop purchase, or $20 off your first month of the Pathway. Again, that's all caps, EXPANDED, EXPANDED. Okay, now back to the episode.
How were you navigating processing all of this while parenting, and how did that impact your parenting?
Yeah, sometimes it was a challenge because I know a lot of people do the work first thing in the morning, but that just doesn't work for me. So what I have found is that when I'm working or writing, which is both the same thing, but I had a second job at the time, I would get this time in the afternoon where I would kind of like get an afternoon slump like we all do, and I could make my own hours, and it was quiet right before I'd have to go get the kids at school. So I did mine in the afternoon during that natural slump that your body gets. So that would help me drop into the DIs really easily, and it would kind of give me a little bit of a nap in the meantime. So I would be refreshed for the rest of the day. But when I was going through the really difficult parts, I had to approach it almost like I was going to a retreat, because to do it like on a random Tuesday and then have to go and pick up the kids and smile and be like, hey, how was your day? And totally be on and present and talking to other parents after having gone through this really incredible experience where you're like crying and you're going through these old memories. That's a lot. And it feels like, whiplash. So I wouldn't do a workshop after a workshop after a workshop. I would take breaks between them, and I would approach each one almost like a retreat. So I would schedule the time, say maybe 6 days in a row, or if I needed to pack it in a little tighter, I would do it in like a condensed time where I would maybe, do like 2 components a day or something like that, to really give myself the space. And I would actually write it into my calendar that that's what I was going to be doing for a few days. And that way I would be mentally prepared for it, and then give myself the time to assimilate back into my normal environment. So I wasn't picking kids up with like puffy eyes. I would take a little break for a while and just sort of let it all process. And then I would dive back in again.
So on those days that you were scheduling in the retreat, were you like finding another ride for the kids, and like would you take off of work, let's say? Or was it more like an afternoon kind of vibe?
So yeah, I would make sure that I would just do it at a time in the day where I could give it more space and time, and then have some time afterward to like sit down with a cup of tea. And I know that sounds really luxurious, and I know that that's a privilege that I had to be able to have that time. And that's not always the case. And this wasn't like the whole last 2 years I was doing TBM. This was a very specific time when I was unpacking most of this. So I think, I kind of want to make that clear, because normally I'm doing it, just like 3-4 times a week, something like that, like is recommended. But when I was going through this really pivotal time right before my manifestations all started coming in and all of these major changes started to happen, for that 1 month, I was approaching it like retreat times. So yeah, I did adjust my schedules. I just happened to have a little bit of a lighter workload at the time. So yeah, I was able to create that time for myself. I wouldn't have always been able to do that, and I certainly wouldn't have been able to keep it up consistently for the long haul, but it worked for a short period of time, and it was actually a lot more powerful.
I think that is so cool. And that's a really interesting sort of hack almost, because I've found when I've had big manifestations come through, or even when I found the most unblocking to be most effective, is that diligent, rigorous, show up every day, create space for it. And no, it's not sustainable indefinitely, but to have a couple times, once, twice a year, where you can say, okay, for this week, I'm showing up 100%, giving an hour or 2 or 3 in the evening, or whenever you can make it work with your schedule, and I'm committing. And also I think the conscious committing to, I have this amount of time right now and I want to get the most out of it, also helps sort of prime you to get more out of the experience as well.
Totally. Yeah, I was looking back at times whenever I'd had major shifts, and it had been whenever I was really focused on something. I don't really do well when I'm dabbling. It just doesn't work for me. And so I look at TBM work as, okay, I'm going to have this special time that's going to be set aside for this very specific workshop or this particular issue that I'm working through or whatever I'm calling in. And then I'm going to take a little bit of a break, and I'm going to do the more like the maintenance DIs. And that also helped my nervous system to acclimate each time something would come in, or sometimes, because it can be a lot. So I would like take a break and just like enjoy the view for a little while and enjoy this new version of myself that was starting to emerge, and do like health and body DI or emotional clearing if something came in. Like I mentioned, unblocked full moon is a big one with me. So those are the kind of ones that I do on a regular basis. And then when it's workshop time, it's workshop time.
Okay, let's look at your list here for a second of like the actual tangible things that came through. So even though it was through the theme of self-worth, what you wound up manifesting a book deal with a top publisher, which was a huge thing on your list from the beginning, a film TV agent with UTA, a top agency for people who aren't familiar, reaching out to ask to represent the film rights, which you said almost never happens. This was so impressive, went from $2,000 in your bank account to six figures in a matter of months with a combination of savvy investing and a bit of increased income, a beautiful new spiritually aligned friendship, comfort and confidence in beauty and sexuality, and less fear around health and wellness. So since you went into the phase 2 of I'm manifesting self-worth, and along with self-worth will come these tangible items, how long from when you crafted your list to when the manifestations came through, would you say?
So there was that original tangible list, which like I said, I just threw away. And I have like a list hack that I do that I could talk about also, because it's just so good. Because just to back up for a minute, the way I craft a list is I originally started by making a literal list. But then I started to notice that would put my brain into it was like almost in work mode to make a list, like a to-do list. So I started changing it into like story mode, where I would journal my list, and I would journal like what it would look like to have this and this and this. And then I would sort of like underline the key words of that. And something about shifting the way I crafted the list had a big impact on my ability to see the motivation behind what I was calling in, and to get to really embody the feeling of having those things, as opposed to it being like a bulleted checklist. So that was a shift in the way I started crafting my lists. But yeah, so I had that original tangible list. I toss it aside. It's like I start writing self-worth, and then I start writing things like I want to be more fun, or, I want to be able to have more fun, more levity in my life, getting rid of these blocks. So all of these qualities I started calling in. From the moment I started to feel some of those qualities start to come in, it was, I want to say, 30 days before the first thing started to come in.
Wow.
Yeah, it was very fast. So I'd been doing this work for a year and a half and just sort of making shifts. Money was the first thing that started to shift for me after Unblocked Money, which was a huge workshop for me, because you don't realize until you're in it how much it is integrated and how much like it has these fingers into everything you do. Mm-hmm. And it's so connected to partnership and just worth in general and shadow. And you discover so many things about yourself with money. So the first thing that started to come in was just starting to see my income rise as I changed my money habits and my money beliefs. And then started doing the work like I mentioned in the deep dive of it. And within 4 weeks, I got a call. I had been waiting for a book deal for 7 years.
Wow.
So it was but the key to it was that I had let go of it. That was part of the process, because as I was doing this work, I started to take a look at what do I really want out of this? And is there a reason why this isn't coming in? And maybe even though fiction writing was what I really wanted, maybe it just wasn't what was aligned with me. So I started to kind of let go of it and say, okay, I'm going to create another career that will give me these same feelings and provide some of these things. And let's take a look at that. And when I did that, it was like 2 days later that my agent called and said that I had gotten a book deal. So letting go was a big part of the process.
Okay, yes. Talk about this, because this actually happened to me in the same exact pattern when I was calling the TBM job. And I was like, I wanted it so bad. And then eventually I was like, well, what would it look like if I worked somewhere else in a different capacity, and started opening my mind to working back in television, but like in a new light, and literally started taking action towards that. And the second I started taking action towards that, the position opened up.
Totally. We talk about it a lot, I think, in spiritual wellness, the act of letting go and the act of surrendering. But the energy behind that is just so powerful, because in doing so, you allow light to come in and this other portal to open that gives you the opportunity to explore something different. And then once you do that, you kind of let go of the dog paddling and the desperation that holds so much of us back. And like, nobody wants desperation in their magnetic self. Nobody's envisioning that quality when they're in their DI. So as long as you're just holding on with like this grip to one thing on your list, I don't think it's going to come in. That's just the way it's worked for me. So yeah, just the act of letting go of it and then figuring out what it was I wanted out of it and how else might I go about getting it. That was just such a big, it was like a breath of fresh air. And I remember feeling this incredible sense of relief coming over me, just thinking I'll always have writing as this wonderful thing I love to do, but maybe it's not what I'm meant to do as a career. So let's look at some other things I've been wanting to do. And that letting go, that peacefulness coming over me, I think made me more magnetic.
I think too, it's connecting to sort of your flexibility and fluidity with how things happen and not attaching so much permanence to one very specific thing to bring you what you think you desire. You know, in one of our previous process episodes, a member was sharing how they wanted this one career and they thought they could never go back to waitressing. But then when they looked at the actual elements of what they wanted, waitressing would give them all of the things they were looking for in a bridge job. And then they're like, okay, this is an easy decision. It really is giving me everything I desire in this moment. And they moved back to waitressing, and then they were able to manifest their passion career after. And I think there's something to being out of rigidity and into flexibility that helps pull in that magnetism. And it's not in a way that you're like, okay, if I say I'm flexible now, then the universe will know. You have to actually feel it. You have to feel open to something new. You have to be willing to let go of something in that process. How did you sort of support yourself in that transition from this is what I've wanted for 7 years? How do I just set it in this limbo instead of holding on to it so tightly?
So, it's funny because the process of doing that was it was so magnetic for me. I made this list, like I said, of all of the things I believed I would have if I had this writing career. I'd been doing work in the entertainment business. That's what I had done for many years. I was in entertainment marketing and I was a freelancer, and it was like this great job. We'll call it a bridge job because it was just a really good job. People treated me well. I was well paid. Just good people. So it was hard to leave, but it wasn't lighting me up. And I knew I wanted to do something else. And so I had these two great loves. And one of them was writing, which was this creative career. And growing up, creative careers were just like not an option. Nobody in my family is particularly creative. And to say you wanted to go into a creative career in my community was like, oh, okay, so you're going to be poor and you're going to be unsuccessful. And that's such a theme in that world, I think, for so many people. So I had already sort of been trying to overcome the idea of that. But then the other thing that I loved was spiritual wellness and metaphysical studies and things like that. So when I was growing up, we had this really, like I said, Christian Catholic upbringing. And those types of things were just like not discussed, and they were not okay. But they were such a big part of my interests from such a young age. I was always really drawn to it. But I learned to like hide the books from the library on those subjects, even though I was getting every single book out. And my mom probably saw them and was like, oh God, I don't know what this is, but I'm just going to ignore it. And I would push it under the rug. And I think I just saw that kind of interest as being, it was just a really hard thing for me to go out and share with the world, but it was something that I wanted to do. So that was actually the other job that I was thinking of crafting for myself, because I had loved human design and I started studying human design. And I thought, you know what? Doing that might actually be something that I could do if fiction writing doesn't work out. And I think I'm ready to put myself out there like that publicly, which was a huge game changer. So once I decided that it was okay for that huge part of my personality to be seen publicly, that's what I think triggered the rest of it. Because when you're writing, you're going to be putting your work out there to a lot of people. So it was more the energy of being okay being seen that made that happen.
And that kind of factors in with some of the tests that you were writing about too around health and how your nervous system would crash like right when a manifestation come through or about to come through, being like, can you hold this space? Talk a bit on that.
Oh my God. Yeah, totally. My tests have always been, I've been tested so many times, but that is definitely one that's come up most of the time, because every time I have a major manifestation come in, or I feel like just up-leveled in general, my nervous system feels like it crashes. I get really exhausted and depleted and sick. And that all goes back to also just conditioning from being a kid and hearing all of these messages like that I was this sort of delicate flower and being an athlete was not something that I was going to be and I couldn't be. I got the messaging that like exercise was almost dangerous. It was like really intense. And it's funny because that's still the messaging I get now. So I just sort of have to, like, when I hear it, I just sort of push it to the side. But it stuck with me. So anytime something big's happening, it's like, oh, now I'm going to have to like rest and recuperate. And it's almost like a test for me because the universe is saying, look, we're ready to give you all of these wonderful things, but are you going to stay small and weak? Or are you going to step up and just like boldly be okay with this? And so I give my body the grace to get through it, and just sort of give it what it needs in that moment. But I don't overindulge and let myself fall into that old patterning. And, it's funny, that's on my list right now as I'm calling in a week intensive with Joe Dispenza, because he does such a good job of covering all of those like health things, because I'm still unpacking all of that, but I've gotten so much better about it.
And talk a bit about this trigger of feeling unwanted. If you were invited somewhere, or if you weren't invited somewhere, you might felt ignored, and how that sort of played into the rejection in writing. And how did you move through unwanted? Like if you were to give someone a remedy of these are the things you have to think about yourself when you're moving out of the space of unwanted to desired or wanted.
So in the DIs, I would this is a lot of the work I did in the DIs with my parents, which was them prioritizing me in a different way and choosing me over just sort of the rest of the life that would be going on. It was always like, when you have a single working mom, she has to put work first. And it's not intentional, but you end up feeling kind of unimportant. You end up at the bottom of the list a lot of the time. And so I was able to go into the DIs and recreate these environments where, like, my dad moved from LA back to Pittsburgh and said, I don't care about LA and I don't care about all of this. I can do this all here, but you're most important and I need to be able to spend these years with you. And having that experience and then actually imagining him at all of these events that he missed. And it made me feel less desperate for that attention. And it made me feel more precious and seen as a child, as opposed to having to stay invisible so that I didn't get in trouble or I didn't cause trouble. So the DIs were definitely a big component of that. And then also every time that would show up as a trigger, I took it through trigger. I would also take it through, like I mentioned, the adult situations where that was playing out again.
And just going back, because I think these triggers are so pertinent to, a lot of people have these. What was sort of your remedy for the average trigger? Because average is such an interesting one where so many things, we see them as polar opposites. You're either the best or the worst. But average kind of hits that bucket where it's like, you feel like you blend in, you're not important, you don't need to shine, you're just kind of like hidden amongst everyone else. How do you combat those triggers of feeling average, and what sort of things were you telling yourself and reprogramming?
So yeah, I think that has a lot to do with, and I'm looking at this really closely with my daughters right now because I'm watching it happen to them as well. And it has nothing to do with parenting. It has to do with the culture of school and the nature of schooling in today's society. I think it just by nature creates a sense of averageness where if you're not the best or the worst, you're invisible. And I think we're raised seeing that if we are not extraordinary at something and we don't catch everybody's attention early on, then we're just average and forgettable. So that's something I'm working on with my own kids right now. Is it's like my daughters, I just don't want them. I see them sometimes falling into the average bucket. And so I am counteracting that messaging at home to help them work through that so they don't have that stick with them. But then as an adult, when you're putting your work out there, I could actually see my manuscript like sitting on an editor's desk and them looking at it and going, it's okay. And then just sort of passing over it and forgetting it. And that image was so clear to me. It was far clearer to me for a long time than somebody picking it up and going, wow, this is an amazing book and I have to get this out to the world. That just seemed completely unbelievable to me for so long.
And we had talked to you on the phone how with this concept of average, how sort of accepting average at some things in our life and knowing that there will always be something that we're exceptional in, and that the goal is kind of not to be exceptional at everything in a perfectionist way, but to find the thing that we feel exceptional at and be okay with being average in other categories. Talk in that a bit too.
Totally. So that's what I'm actually teaching my daughters, is that I'm saying to them, it's okay if you're just average at this. Don't worry about it. Like, that's perfectly normal. We're not going to be good at and excellent at every single thing we try. So when you're average at something, embrace it. And it's the universe's way of redirecting you to find something that you're going to be extraordinary about. And so I encourage them we do a lot of like rabbit holes, where if I say, if they want to dive into a rabbit hole and learn all about something new, and then they discover, oh, I'm actually like not great at this, or I don't really enjoy it, that's okay. And I give them the freedom to explore all of that, because each time that happens, it's just redirecting them to a place where they're going to find something they're extraordinary at. Like my older daughter, she just couldn't get into her zone at school. She just didn't know what she was good at. And she just kept trying all of these things. And then one day she just sort of like started she started painting and getting into art a little bit more, and then found out it was her biggest talent. And so I let her say like, okay, so it's okay that you're average at these other things, because you're actually kind of extraordinary at this one thing. And when you give yourself the ability to release that perfectionism and that need to be great at everything, it just opens up so much space for you to really dive into and find the things you're really good at.
And I love that you're encouraging them to do that too, because it's what really your rabbit hole technique is really encouraging them to follow their pings. Like if they're interested in this, dive down that full force. If you wind up not interested, or it's not really a thing after all, great, move on. You probably picked up some cool insight from it, some things about yourself. And now you're, like you said, redirected and moved back onto a path that's more aligned and authentic. And all of the things that you pick up along the way are part of creating your unique story and your exceptional story, which is so fascinating.
Yeah, totally. And I share TBM with them in an age-appropriate way. They're 10 and 13. And I give them, like, we use the word ping. And I'll say, which teaches them to pay attention to their intuition and to value it when they get that message. It's so important, because I think that kids sometimes don't know how to understand what that feeling is. And so when you assign it a name, and it's such a clever name, like ping, it's fun. And they're like, oh, I understand what that is. So they get that. And then I've taught them hell yes, which we call like heck yes in our house.
Yay.
And I teach them if it's not a full body yes, then maybe take a look at what you're feeling. And they're old enough to understand that. And then the rabbit hole deep dive, like whatever you need. And we've done unblocked full moon together. I take them to the beach, and we on the full moon, and we make our list of like what came through in the last month and what we'd like for the next month. And they're going through that experience. And so it's fun to start sharing that language with them.
I love that. What are any other tips you might have for people who are navigating this work or have been doing it for a while, and maybe they manifested some things, but they're kind of hitting that maybe a plateau? What tips and tools would you suggest?
For me, one of the lessons that I had to learn was that being magnetic doesn't mean that life is perfect. You sometimes get this idea in your mind, they're going to be like this jolly, happy person walking through your magnetic self, and you're glowing, and you're walking through in your perfect clothes, and all these wonderful things are coming in. But that's just not the reality a lot of the time. And I think that holding on to your self-worth through heartbreak and disappointment, or not feeling well, illness, maybe not getting the job, or not being like, if you love somebody and they don't love you back, those are things that are going to happen in normal life. But if you can hold on to your self-worth through those events, that's incredibly magnetic. And that's the secret sauce. It's easy to feel like you're in your self-worth when everything's going great. The challenge is whenever it's not, and you're low, and you can say, this is making me incredibly sad, or I'm incredibly disappointed, or I'm heartbroken right now, or I'm scared, and say, but you know what? I'm still okay. And I know that I'm going to come out of this. And you kind of maintain that self-worth. And I think that that's tremendously magnetic. And when I've been able to do that, that's when some really amazing things have come through.
It's like this, you're developing a partnership truly with yourself, I think, as you start doing this self-help work and self-actualization work and the TBM work. You really are creating this new relationship with yourself. That's the person you turn to when, for lack of a better word, shit hits the fan. Mm-hmm. Now you have someone to turn to no matter what, that will never leave you, that is always there for you, that has your best interest at heart, that loves you. You know what I mean? Like, you have that already within you. You've had it the whole time. And learning and developing that relationship with self, I think, is so key. And exactly what you said, like, that's true magnetism, is leaning on you.
Totally. Yes, I totally agree. What I have found as somebody doing this work, and it's funny because one of my closest friends who's actually on my manifestation list she's become a really good friend of mine, and she's in her 20s. And it's funny because we both approach, we can talk about the work together, but we're at these two totally different parts in our times in our life. So we learn from each other in a really interesting way. But as somebody who's a little bit older, you can look at TBM as this opportunity to rewrite your story and to create a new one, and not to feel like you're this foregone conclusion just because you're coming into it later. Once you go through the work, like for me, as soon as I've gotten to a new place, I take a break and I just start writing out a gratitude list, and I take time to just like enjoy the view from a new level. And then say like, okay, well, who am I now? And I don't have to be this person that I was in all of these old stories or these old memories or these old patterns. You can relive it in the DIs and then let go. And just that act of, I've done that where I come out of a DI and I just say, okay, this particular feeling, this emotion, this part of my shadow, it just doesn't serve me anymore. It served me for a long time. It's not part of who I am anymore. And I just release it and I let it go. Who am I going to be now? And I think that's a really important way to look at it whenever you have a few more years behind you.
I love that. I think that's so helpful. You also wrote a little bit about compassion being a different energetic than forgiveness. And how did you approach forgiving people in your life or forgiving past versions of you? And how did you approach having compassion for those people and having compassion for yourself?
That was a tough one. I was looking through events in my life where I did not go through it with a tremendous amount of self-worth. And it's easy to look back and just be like, I can't even believe that I handled it that way. But then, I was able to find forgiveness for myself because I was able to see why it was so important that I had that experience and what lessons I took away from it. But in terms of forgiveness, when we go into these DIs and we're talking about finding magnetic parents, and we're all like, who are your magnetic parents? What do they look like? And it almost implies that we don't find our own parents to have been good enough. And that's a pretty negative energy to hold on to. And it can be really sad. And I think it can make it hard to move on from. And so, we may have had some really shitty things happen to us, and we did not have what we deserved in different scenarios. And we wish that somebody would have just done a better job in other areas. So I know the first time I went through, I just felt so much anger because I'd be like, this is shitty. I wanted something better. And I would just feel like this sense of anger. But then when I started to go through it in a way that I think I went through it like almost as a parent, from one parent to another, and looking at my own weaknesses or flaws and saying like, oh God, what are my kids going to have to unpack when they're grown-ups? I started to have compassion for my parents and for my caregivers and my community and say, like, they were just doing the best they could too. And you don't have to go in and forgive them, and you can start to let go of the anger. And I think there's a lot of healing in that.
I think that's such an important aspect too, because I think we avoid looking at certain things because we're afraid of the anger, or we don't think we can feel forgiveness, but tapping into the energy of like, well, I can understand that they are just a hurt person too, and that they had their own struggles, and lean into that compassion energetic first. It almost helps you see, okay, can I release this story now and lean into forgiveness?
Absolutely.
Okay, so be all of our magnetic moms for a moment. And what is one sentiment, kind of closing note that you can share with the audience about what it feels like to manifest self-worth and what that dynamic is?
It feels like slowness and gracefulness. It feels to me like I stopped the act of desperation and hurrying and like criticizing myself all of the time, and just kind of going, wow, I'm going to only be in this moment once. How can I handle it with as much grace as possible? And I would close my eyes, and I still do this a lot, where I will close my eyes and just bring up an image of my magnetic self or one of my expanders and embody that physically. There's a big part of it, I think, is when when you embody something physically, you stand like that person or you dress like that person, even just for a little while, you become it. You have to try. You can't just sort of go on as your same self and expect new things to happen. And so there's just like a gracefulness to it, and a calmness and a peacefulness that once you just sort of know you're deserving of these things, and that even though you may not have gotten that messaging when you were young, that's not your story anymore. It's time to create a new one and start living as that person.
That is such the key, is start living as that person. Create that person in the neural architecture. It's one thing to feel it in the DI. You mentioned this in the beginning. It's one thing to feel it there. But when real life hits you, it's like starting to see all those opportunities to self-criticize or to beat yourself up or whatever it is in your mind. Those are all tests. Those are all tests, testing you. Are you going to say that nasty thing to yourself in your head? Are you going to ruminate on what you did wrong in this situation again? Are you going to give yourself grace and love and compassion and say, okay, I did the best I could. Maybe I'm not happy with it, but let's move on. I deserve to have a happy, fulfilled life.
Totally. Yes.
So cool. And then any other last closing notes for the TBM community? Any other things that you would have wanted to hear when you were starting your journey?
I think the message I wish I would have told myself, or what it could have heard, is that it takes time. I think we get these formulas and we think, oh, okay, we're going to do this workshop and we're going to do this workshop and we're going to listen to every podcast and then everything's going to be great. But, there's that phrase, it takes 9 months to get pregnant, and it takes 9 months to like recover from being pregnant and become unpregnant. Yeah. It's kind of like that. I mean, you're not going to fix all of this. Even if you're one of those people who is going to be like, okay, I'm going to do every single workshop and I'm really going to do this like 6 hours a day. It doesn't work that way. It's a gradual process, and you're unpacking years here. And so take your time and really give it the space it needs. And no, you can't do that every day because life happens. And, sometimes you just have to do the best you can. Maybe you're doing it while you're walking or in your car, or just kind of sneaking it into your routine. But don't give up, because it doesn't happen right away. When I look back now over the last 2 years, I thought I wasn't calling anything in, but then I see these little shifts and these little things that did start to come in, but it was just like it needed some time to really take effect. So give it that time and be patient, and then you'll start to see it in hindsight how much it's working.
It's so cool too, hearing someone saying the number one thing on my list was manifesting self-worth, and then sitting here with me today feeling like I am in my self-worth. Like, that's such a expander for everyone out there to know, like you're saying, step by step, and you can have that feeling. You can have the qualities, you can manifest the things. It is all possible. Just keep showing up.
It's true. And I think you also have to look at it like an evolution, because each phase for me was so different. And you're going to become a different person as you go through, just because we're all growing. And so you may approach the work one way the first time through, and then you're just like at a different level. Or even if you've manifested, if you're one of those people who have manifested every single thing on your list and you're like, wow, I've got this. If you go through it again, you're going to find all new things and you're going to approach the work in a whole different way. So it's definitely a continual process that evolves with you. And then you can just sort of keep going through the cycle and seeing where it takes you. So I'm so excited. I have things on my list now, and I have all of these triggers, and I have these tests and a new list that I have. And so now it's almost like I'm starting over. And that's fun because I'm starting from this new place.
Yes. It's like a new sense of self, a more aligned sense of self every step of the way.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so exciting. Thank you so much, Kelley. This was incredible. I know your story will be so expansive to so many people out there.
Oh, thanks so much. It was so good being here.
Yes. And we'll see you guys all next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning into the episode, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, we did. And in case you're not totally ready to join the pathway yet, I wanted to share a few of our free offerings that I'll often suggest to people as a little bit of a blueprint to get them started on their manifestation journey. The first place I like to direct people completely for free is the motivation. You can see it linked below or on our homepage as our testimony library. And it's categorized by different subjects, whether you're calling in career, money, love, wellness, and much more. When you're reading about a member's experience of what they manifested, you're actually seeing to believe and showing your subconscious that that very thing is possible for you. The second place I like to direct people is to the free clarity exercise, which is also linked below. In it, you get to try our own unique hypnosis process, learn about the science, and some journaling prompts. And the best part about this, you'll get a tiny taste of what it's like to go into your hypnotic state, bring your subconscious forward, and create new neural pathways while receiving clarity. And the third thing, if you haven't listened to it on this podcast yet, please go back to the episode titled Manifestation 101, where you'll learn the basics of neural manifestation to truly understand this process. So go ahead and check out those free resources, the motivation, the free clarity exercise, and the episode Manifestation 101, all linked below. And in an effort to make sure to have representation in this process series, go ahead and submit any process testimonials you have, especially to our LGBTQ+ community, our BIPOC, as well as the Ys, which is anyone in the community who is 45 and over. All right, we'll be back next week.